Good morning. Welcome to Camden, Arkansas's First United Methodist Church Sunday School class. I am Ellen Horseman, and it's good to have you this week. I am finishing up a little look at a book by Matt Rawle. It's called The Heart That Grew Three Sizes, Finding Faith in the Story of the Grinch, based on the actual story by Dr. Seuss, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. And I think I've said this before, there's way more in that book than what we can go over. So if you've not had a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. This week, I'm looking at his last chapter, and Rawls says that, or one of the things I liked, I guess, that he said is that he sees a parallel in the Grinch story and the scenes, as he calls them, the three scenes in Luke's narrative of the birth of Christ. And that narrative is in chapter 2. So let me begin reading that to you. So from the first 7 verses, that will be scene 1, as it were. In those days, Caesar Augustus declared that everyone throughout the empire should be enrolled in the tax list. This first enrollment occurred when Quirinius governed Syria. Everyone went to their own cities to be enrolled. And I'm going to stop myself for just a minute and say, okay, how does this scene, as it were, begin? It begins with the emperor, the Caesar, the most powerful person in the ancient world, in that Roman Empire. And he's more than likely at his palace, the seat of authority, the seat of human power. And he orders a census. And the reason that they did a census in the Roman Empire about every 5 years or so was twofold. Partly, well, let me just say, they didn't just count people. They really counted people's possessions. That's the reason for the census. Now, partly that was used to give a person status, depending on how many possessions the person had, but it was primarily used so that Caesar could get taxes. So he's basically counting a person's possessions, so he'll see how many of those possessions he can take onto himself, his taxes. And this particular translation made that clear. So that's how we begin. But now we're going to move from Caesar all the way in that palace, all the way to a little manger in a stable. And you know the story. Since Joseph belonged to David's house and family line, he went up from the city of Nazareth in Galilee to David's city called Bethlehem in Judea. He went to be enrolled together with Mary, who was promised to him in marriage and who was pregnant. And while they were there, the time came for Mary to have her baby. She gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him snugly, and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the guest room. So you've gone from an emperor to a baby born to a peasant couple and born in a stable with a bunch of animals around. So there's that scene. Well, let's move over to the scene in the story of the Grinch. In the very beginning of the story of the Grinch seems to think he holds all the power. That makes him kind of parallel to Caesar. I mean, Grinch goes into the homes. He doesn't make people move. He goes into their homes, but he does it to move them to despair. He doesn't count all their possessions as Caesar does. He takes all their possessions so that he can move them to misery. So both Caesar and the Grinch, they hunger for power, and they both want the world to know who is in charge. The Grinch thinks that he's going to be in charge of Christmas because he's going to take all their possessions. Caesar believes that he's in charge, and he wants everybody to know it. Now, Grinch, unlike Caesar, has a remarkable transformation when he hears the Who's singing. He's expecting something miserable, but instead, we don't know what they sing, but it has to be a song of joy because he realizes that the song is merry, very merry, and not at all like what he expected. And so he is completely disarmed by their singing. Well, in this early part of Luke, as Rawls says, we are also unexpectedly disarmed. He says through Luke's careful unfolding from Caesar to Christ, we begin to realize that it is the child in the manger and not the emperor in the palace who has the power to move us. So that's the first scene. Let's move on to the next scene which is begins in verse 8 of chapter 2. So let me read it to you. Nearby shepherds were living in the fields guarding their sheep at night. The Lord's angel stood before them. The Lord's glory shone around them, and they were terrified. The angel said, "Don't be afraid. Look, I bring good news to you, wonderful, joyous news for all people. Your Savior is born today in David's city. He is Christ the Lord. And this is a sign for you. You will find a newborn baby wrapped snugly and lying in a manger." And suddenly a great assembly of the heavenly forces was with the angel, praising God, and they said, "Glory to God in heaven, and on earth peace among those whom he highly favored." So here we are. An angel has come to these shepherds and told them, "I've got some joyous news for you, and I'm even going to give you a sign about that joyous news." Well, you can imagine or how surprised these shepherds must have been. Remember, the shepherds were considered about the lowliest of people in their society. Shepherds were unclean because they were out around these animals all the time. And so it must have been quite a shock to these common shepherds that an angel appears. And then a little bit later, a whole host of angels. And then, what a surprise. The angel is telling them, I'm bringing you a sign. I'm giving you a sign. Well, I rather doubt they were expecting any kind of a sign, much less one that's being announced by an angel. I mean, how surprised can you be? Here's an angel essentially telling you that the Messiah, the anointed one for whom you've been waiting and for whom all your people have been waiting all these years, that the Messiah has been born, and that the announcement of this coming of the Messiah is being given to shepherds, the ones receiving this news. They're unclean shepherds. And then, if that's not surprising enough, these shepherds are actually invited to go and see the Messiah. Well, Grinch too receives some surprises. As I said earlier, the sound that he receives was not at all what he expected. He's expecting everyone to boo-hoo. He's expecting everyone to be upset about Christmas. And I'm trying to flip open my book. And here's what the author says. He stared down at Whoville, the Grinch. He popped his eyes. And then he shook. What he saw was a shocking surprise, because he hasn't heard what he expected, and what he saw was a shocking surprise. And of course, what he sees is everyone down in Whoville, the tall and the small, was singing without any presents at all. He hadn't stopped Christmas from coming. It came somehow or another. It came just the same. So that's the big surprise that the Grinch gets, something completely unexpected by him. That's when he learns that maybe Christmas is more than the presents and the decorations and the foods. Christmas is so much more. I'm going to say that with the recent devastating tornadoes that we've had, I've heard more than one news anchor say something to the effect of how terrible it is for these people to lose everything they own right before Christmas. Of course, I can't help but hear that and think, like there's some good time to lose everything you own. But we have this notion that you can't ever have any sadness at Christmas time, or that you shouldn't have to deal with sadness. But come on, let's be real about it. All of us, I imagine, if you're an adult and you've lived long enough, you've experienced some hard Christmas in your life. Maybe not because a tornado made your house blow away, but perhaps because of an illness, or perhaps because of the death of someone that you really love. They might have died near Christmas time, or if not, then sometime during the year. So we've all had a blue Christmas, just like Elvis Presley did. But I'm remembering one in particular when my dad had a massive stroke, and he was in the ICU, and we literally did not know if he was going to live. The doctors didn't know if he was going to live, and if he did live, how handicapped he would be, which, addendum, he lived and he was handicapped. But we didn't know whether he was going to continue to be with us or not. So I flew to Virginia and stayed in a guest home there with my mother because the hospital was about an hour away from where she lived. And that's the Christmas that we went through. But the wonderful thing is that in spite of everything that was going on, in spite of, this was one of those ICUs where you could visit so many times, we went every time, but we still went to midnight mass together and met the rest of our family there. And I can tell you that it was still Christmas. That somehow, as a matter of fact, the beauty of the hymns and the remembrance of what God had done for us in sending his only son, it was more intense and more real. It touched me more deeply then than it ever had before. Because after all, my friends, the true light had come into the world, and the darkness could not extinguish it. Yes, Christmas really is more about presents and decorations and food. Christmas is more than those old glitzy Hallmark movies that I love to watch. You know, those little movies where everyone goes crazy building gingerbread houses because, of course, they're having a contest, where you have communal sing-alongs and where you have these wonderful tree lighting ceremonies. Christmas is more than that. And it's more than our wreaths, and it's more than our decorations. It's more than our presents. It's more than our hymns. It's more than our beautiful candlelight Christmas Eve service. As Matt Rawle says, take away everything, and Jesus was born anyway, and continues to be born in us through God's grace every day. Love truly did come down at Christmas. Okay, so let's go to scene 3, which is the next few verses of Luke. I think it starts with verse 15. Let me open her up here. Yep, sure enough, verse 15 through 18. When the angels returned to heaven, the shepherds said to each other, "Let's go right now to Bethlehem and see what's happened. Let's confirm what the Lord has revealed to us." They went quickly and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in the manger, and when they saw this, they reported what they had been told about this child, and everyone who heard it was amazed at what the shepherds told them. So, let's go back to the Grinch, because after he hears the singing, and he's amazed, he looks down and sees all the Who's singing, the narrator tells us that he has to spend 3 hours pondering. But once he has pondered and he comes to a realization about Christmas not being about presents and stuff, he takes the toys and all the things he's gathered up in his sled. He had them up on the mountain, about to push them over when he heard the singing, and he takes these and he rushes back down to Whoville without any idea about how he might be received, but he's going to give them their presents and their decorations and their food. This is an act of giving on his part. I mean, granted, he probably shouldn't have taken it to begin with. He's only returning it to them. But he could have just, knocked it off the side of the mountain. But instead, he decides to give everything back and to put himself in a position where he might really be frowned upon, since he was the guy that stole it to begin with. Well, you see the shepherds in that scene from Luke, and they hurry as well. As soon as they've heard from the angels, they hurry and they say, "Let's go see." And I think about them approaching that stable where there was just a baby and all the smells. And here were common people with this baby. What did they see? Do you ever wonder about how they approached this child? I mean, did they approach with some skepticism like, well, the angels told us, let's go see? Did they wonder, can this really be the Messiah? Can this really be the anointed one for whom our people have waited all these years? Did they approach with wonder? I mean, could they really have understood what they were seeing or what they were going to see? And for that matter, can we really fully grasp the wonder of what those shepherds would see? I mean, think about this, friends. As John puts it in his gospel, the Word became flesh. God, the one who created this massive universe that we see, God put on human flesh. God's love was so complete that God has come to dwell with us humans. God's love so complete they saw, that a light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. Well, certainly, after the shepherds encounter Christ, they are changed. Well, Luke doesn't elaborate on it a lot, but what do they do in Luke immediately after they've seen the child? These are the shepherds who had nothing to say to the angels. They were the silent shepherds, so to speak, but they're not silent anymore. They are going out according to Luke, and they're not going back out to the flock right away. They're going around telling everyone what they have seen. They've changed, haven't they? They're not content to just be quiet. They just are bursting to tell what has happened. And at the end of the story of the Grinch, we also see that the Grinch has changed. And we talked about that a minute ago. I mean, his heart, as the narrator says, his heart grew 3 sizes that day. Now, at the very end of the story, I mean, the very last page in this story, you've got the Grinch and you've got the Who's sitting down at the table. We're told he took all the presents back. We don't have a scene that tells us what the Who's did, but it's pretty obvious they forgive him, because it says he took everything else, and at the end it was the Grinch himself who carved the beast. And you can see a picture of him, if you're looking at it, sitting there with the Who's. So they're sitting at table together. And so here it is. The Grinch is carving the Christmas beast, which means he's sitting at the head of the table. So the one who was the thief, the would-be thief, has obviously been forgiven by the Who's. There's obviously been reconciliation between the Who's and Grinch, because they take this Grinch who had been an outsider, they take this Grinch who had been a thief, and they give him the place of honor. You know, Matt Rawle comments that we mistakenly think that the point of Dr. Seuss's story is that Christmas isn't about presents. But the true insight of this story is the joy of reconciliation. So there is joy in Whoville in this reconciliation, and there is joy in Bethlehem for the one who came to reconcile us with God. We have joy. God is with us. We have joy, for God invites us to come and see. We have joy because God invites us into the very joy of his love. And my friends, this is true Christmas joy. It's when we learn to care for all of God's children, even for the ones who don't think like we do, even for the ones who are of a different race or a different economic status or class than we are. This is the true joy of Christmas, when we learn to care about all of those people. And this is the true Christmas joy, when we learn to seek out the lost. And I'm not just talking about people who don't meet our definition of being a Christian, or people we think might be going to hell, but when we seek for the lost, people who are lost in despair, in desperation, or in loneliness. This is true Christmas joy. When we learn to make room at the table for the very least of Jesus's brothers and sisters, the ones whom society has forgotten or rejected. That, my friends, is the real Christmas joy. So may we make room for that true love and joy that came down at Christmas. My friends, may you experience the love of Christ in your hearts today. May you experience the joy of sharing that Christmas love and that Christmas joy with other people. And may you have a blessed and wonderful Christmas. God bless you.